So far we've been talking about letter writing in antiquity, and we've been talking very much about the physicality of letter writing. This is to remind us that Paul's letters didn't originally come between the covers of a hardback book or conveniently online. We don't have the autographs, the original letters. We only have them as they were later collected, as we'll learn in days to come. Why should we focus on letter writing first? There are two reasons, I think. The first is that the letters of Paul are intimate and familiar. We write letters too, and the formal characteristics of letters in the ancient world are similar to our own. The second reason is to remind us that these letters are distant and unfamiliar, that we're engaging in a cross-cultural and cross-historical investigation. It forces us to exercise our historical imaginations, to think, how did they send letters in antiquity? How might an illiterate person write a letter? Today we're going to turn from the technical aspects of letter writing to questions about education and writing in the ancient world. We're going to talk about rhetoric. What is rhetoric? In the United States, at least, rhetoric is a bad word. That's mere rhetoric, we might say, or don't give me that rhetoric. When I use the term rhetoric to talk about Paul's letters or about ancient writings in the Mediterranean world, hear it as a neutral term. In the ancient world, the well-educated were trained in rhetoric. Rhetoric was about the communication of ideas. Many letters in the ancient world, including Paul's letters, used rhetorical conventions. In the educational system of the Greco-Roman world, after your elementary education, and then after your training with a grammaticus, you would progress to rhetorical education, the third level. Books still exist of progymnasmata, or rhetorical exercises. These allow us to see what students were being asked to do in school. You were asked to write as if you were Homer, Thucydides, or Herodotus. That is, as the great writers in Greek epic, history, and ethnography. You might be asked to imitate another's rhetoric in order to learn about persuasion and argument. Or, as a student in the ancient world, you might be asked to write a speech as if you were a famous historical figure responding to an event. To write a speech as if you were someone who had never seen the sea and were encountering it for the first time. Aristotle is a famous philosopher and was the teacher of Alexander the Great. He wrote his book on rhetoric in the 4th century BCE, and in it he talked about earlier definitions of rhetoric, specifically sophistical rhetoric, which was defined as the art of persuasion. He goes further. Persuasion, he writes, is produced by speech itself, when we establish the true or apparently true from the means of persuasion applicable to each individual subject. Towards the end of the 1st century CE, just after the time of Paul's letter writing, Quintilian wrote in Latin about rhetoric. His book, Institutes of Oratory, is interested in rhetoric as it's used not by the philosopher but by the political man, and I say man deliberately. He defines rhetoric for this political man as the knowledge of how to speak well. But I want to bring us back to Aristotle. Aristotle had connected rhetoric to both ethics and to politics. Why should we spend so much time on Aristotle, a man who was in the court of Alexander the Great, a man who wrote about 250 years before Paul? We do because Paul too had some training in rhetoric, and his letters take part in some of the conventions that Aristotle made famous. Greek paideia, that is Greek education or culture, was a goal even in the Roman period, even of someone like Paul perhaps. Looking at Aristotle more closely can give us a framework for thinking about how Paul's letters were part of a larger literary culture. It can also help us to think about how their hearers may have been impacted by them. I want us to keep in mind two concepts that Aristotle made famous. The first is this. Aristotle stated that rhetoric was made up of ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos has to do with the speaker's character, with the speaker's presentation of him or herself as credible and good. Aristotle writes, "We believe good men more fully and more readily than others. This is true generally, whatever the question is. The rhetor's, the speaker's character, may also be called the most effective means of persuasion he possesses." Another word we might use to talk about this is self-construction. The ethos is the way in which the writer constructs him or herself. The second term that Aristotle talked about was pathos. And to quote him again, the orator persuades by means of his hearers when they are roused to emotion by his speech. For the judgments we deliver are not the same when we are influenced by joy or sorrow, by love or hate. He talks about putting the hearer in a certain frame of mind. That is, a good rhetor, a good speaker, a good writer, evokes emotion in the hearer, the reader, the audience. The third point that Aristotle makes is the importance of logos. That is, speech itself, of course, is a means to persuade. Aristotle has another three-part framework that New Testament scholars use to analyze Paul's letters. Ancient writing could usually be divided into three forms of rhetoric. The first is judicial, or forensic. Such speech has to do with an event that's over and now is to be recounted, defended, or attacked, as in a courtroom setting. The second is deliberative or advising rhetoric. That usually has to do with an event in the future, the question of what should be done to shift or to influence that event. This kind of rhetoric was often found among the ecclesiae, or the political debates of the Greek city. And the third form of rhetoric is epideictic. It's an event that's occurring in the present, and one praises or blames the current person or situation. As we approach each letter of Paul, we should ask what parts seem to serve what function in Aristotle's thought. Would the recipients of Paul's letters likely have heard a judicial tone, accusing or defending past action? Would the recipients have likely heard a deliberative tone, advising, cajoling people to think about their future together? Would the recipients have likely heard epideictic rhetoric, the language of praise or blame? We should ask ourselves, how does our assessment of the sort of rhetoric Paul uses influence how we read the text? And how do we gain proficiency in the clues that tell us what kind of rhetoric is being used? It's so hard to hear tone or emotion in email, in letters, much less in cultures and times and places not our own. I want for us to keep rhetoric, not mere rhetoric, but the creative, inventive, important use of words to communicate meaning, in mind for all of our course readings. Whether we're reading an ancient text, like one of Paul's letters, or a more recent scholarly interpretation, I want us to think about Aristotle's two lists and to question, first, how does this writing use ethos, pathos, and logos? And how does it construct the writer? What is it trying to evoke from the hearer or reader? And the second thing that I want us to ask is this writing judicial, deliberative, epideictic, or some combination of the three? Is it accusing or defending past action? Is it advising or cajoling towards the future? Does it praise or blame present action?